Hola, chicas y compañeros, and thank you for watching my little video. This one focuses on American literature, and again, these videos are connected to my work as an instructor. I'm Dr. Stone Meredith, Dr. M, to my students at Colorado State University Global Campus. And in this little video, we're going to talk about some of the themes that are really important in the last 100 years, particularly the movements of modernism and postmodernism, and the two ideas that really drive both of those. Because as we move through that course, which is called English 532, it's important, I think, to remember that American literature in this course is the final course in a sequence of a program. Again, always want to talk about what that program means. It's the Colorado State University Global Program in Graduate English Learning Certificate. So completing this program gives teachers the ability to teach young folks, high school students, dual enrollment credit, so they can earn dual enrollment credit before they complete their high school program and go on to college. And so I always want to stress what agency that gives these young people to see that during their high school time, they're actually preparing for their future and actually kind of assuming the sale, right? That their ideas are worthy of going on to some kind of higher education and that they, in fact, deserve the opportunity to pursue their dreams in whatever form of higher education that might be. So always want to remind us of why we're here in those courses and why this work, challenging though it may be, as teachers try to keep their school life and their personal life and now their professional life going. So I want to celebrate all the chicas y compañeros who make the choice to teach and to try to advance their certificate so that you can all give agency to these young people and show them that their ideas have early merit and early value in the larger world. Again, I really feel like this program is the best of what American education can offer for that reason. And this course in American literature, which really starts by definition after the Civil War, which is where most American lit courses will start, or at least modern American lit courses will start in the American Academy and the American higher education system. I think it is a lovely way to wrap up our program, but it's also an important component for folks to have just for general knowledge and to be kind of part of the culture and to understand who we are as a nation and where we came from, because this period is the first time where America really has her own voice and she's really in the driver's seat because she's been in the literary conversation for a long time. And if you think of in the Western world, which is usually where composition studies and American literature studies go, and English studies in the United States for obvious reasons. For one thing, there are a lot of people who speak our language, but they're also the countries and cultures that formed our nation, right? So if you think of Europe and the New World, we're talking really about a lot of Western literature and Western writing instruction. English works so differently from so many other languages, but there is a real kindred connection between composition, where the program starts, and also literature with the Western world. If you think about how old the traditions are, for example, in England, France, and Spain, just to name the two that we work and align with a lot and see a lot in our new world, right, due to colonization and other issues. It really is not until we take our first leaps into romanticism with folks like Poe and then come into realism where voices like Twain emerge in such a large way that America starts to have her own literary nationalism, her own identity. And so by the time we get to the last century, America is a force and she is a voice, and her ideas are included in literary studies and composition theory. And so in this English 532 and in teaching American literature in general, we see a lot of courses begin at 1865 or post Civil War, and that moment when, you know, after the Civil War and Matthew Brady's photograph, it's pretty easy to see why realism is such a big chunk, right? People are seeing in pretty close to what they would imagine is real time. So within a few days or certainly a few weeks, they're seeing images of their brothers and sisters, of their brothers and rarely sisters, but mostly men in the war, right, of their brothers and their fathers and their uncles and their loved ones killing each other on the battlefield and dying. And there are images of that. Concurrently, they're also seeing images of Western expansion and manifest destiny realized, and all those kinds of ideas that as a culture we're revisiting, and what that means, and who really suffered and who really proffered, and what manifest really means. But in, around the Civil War's conclusion, it's very easy to see how realism has really set in because of technology, right? If no other reason. And I think it's always important when you're looking at literature and looking at literary movements to look around you and say what was going on in all the sciences. Where was technology? How were people getting their literature? How were people getting their news? What advances were made in science? What was art doing? What were ballet and opera and other forms of dance doing? And you can almost always kind of see it and feel it and touch it in the literature. And so we start off by saying what's going on in realism and what drives it. Those are some of the key factors, right? And then, of course, out of realism, I think it's almost natural as we go into the next century. And Freud tells us, do you really know what you're thinking? And again, in our modern times, we're revisiting our ideas. Was he a misogynist? Did he force all these ideas driven by masculinity on us? Certainly a topic to discuss, but they're part of our conscious and subconscious, right to the point where we can all watch Frasier and get the jokes that link back there. So we look at the turn of the century and we see all the changes, the Industrial Revolution, right? The principles of uncertainty, Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, all these kinds of ideas coming together, right? Nietzsche has told us that God is dead. There's so much going on at one time that by the time World War I hits, and we've been in this time of really hardcore look at yourself in the mirror and face it realism in a culture that is very well aware of the working class and very well aware of the poverty, but also very well aware of this American dream that's been held out in front in all the factories and give us your tired and your poor, right? By the time World War I comes along, is it any wonder that movements like humanism take rise? Is it any wonder that people come out of realism and start to imagine a humanist reality in the world? And so that's certainly one of the themes we examine in the course. But now I really want to talk about the two large words that really, to me, drive American literature for the last half of the century. Some people say we're in modernism still. Modernism, of course, comes out of World War I. Writers like Hemingway and Fitzgerald make it super, super famous. The Great Gatsby, The Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls. People like Gertrude Stein, some argue, make them both possible. John Dos Passos is very experimental. Some of their cursory friends, these folks who gather in Paris and create the Lost Generation and all those kinds of ideas that we teach traditionally. So everybody pretty much agrees that modernism comes out of the First World War. Modernism permeates everything. It permeates all the humanities, all the sciences. We're in a modernist moment. But when postmodernism starts is really up for debate. And so I really want you to think about that. And I really want you to focus on when you think postmodernism happens, starts, begins, and ends. Some people in our field say we're just still living in modernism and there is no such thing. Other people have a very different moment when they think there was a break. And so these are the two terms I want you to keep in mind as you work to define when you see modernism as a movement and if and when you see postmodernism as a movement. And those terms are ontology and epistemology. So in general terms for literary studies, ontology is the loss of knowing how to be. And that is the loss that generates the modernist movement. That in the past we had codes. If you follow the church, if you follow the law, think of the puritanical faith that founded America. Think of our legal system and all these freedoms in a country where if somebody's treated unfairly, we just make an amendment. And so all of these truths with a capital T seem to be working so well, not only in America, but really in Europe as well, where so much progress toward justice had seemed to come out of the revolt we see in the Romantic periods. You know, America has their revolt, France has theirs soon after, monarchies change, leadership changes, and so there was just so much hope and so much this idea that if you do certain things, if you follow the Catholic Church, if you follow a Calvin based church and their guidelines, whatever the choice may be, that there was this potential to follow a code and that you would know how to be, you knew how to act, you followed the laws, you followed your faith, and everything would work out okay. And of course, World War One, you know, by then Brady's photographs have become a major media industry where people are seeing very rapidly and reading very rapidly, thanks to the telegraph and other technologies, that Europe is destroyed, and thousands of young people are brutally dying on the fields every day in ways no one ever imagined with all this new technology. And so all of a sudden, it seems like there's no way to know how to be. And so modernism takes away our ontology, our way of knowing how to be. And not only does it take it away for America, it takes it away for the Western world. And so this flourish of the modernist movement out of those ashes, you know, to take some of the kind of Eliot images out of those ashes, right? And some of the other great poets of that time, out of those ashes comes this idea that we can make it new. We have lost everything we ever held certain of knowing how to be in this world. So let's go back to the form. Let's go back to the ancient Greeks. Let's go back to these things that we held as standard, and let's make it new. And so that idea of we'll just make it new, the answer is there is no answer. And so let's make it new and begin again. And so these are some pretty standard, I mean, it's not me being a rocket scientist. These are some pretty standard conversations around modernism and that loss of ontological certainty. And I credit Dr. Philip Cibiora at the University of South Florida, who was my dissertation director, who really ingrained that knowledge in me. So to cite my source, and for all those who are taking this course with me, that's your academic lineage. Phil Cibiora came from the great Canavy at the University of Texas, and so that's a little bit about your academic lineage in literary and rhetorical studies. So modernism goes along, and then we know what happens, right? The Depression, oh, the 30s are bad, too much fun in the 20s, real bad situation in the 30s. And then by the 40s, we're in our Second World War. And once again, the destruction is terrible. Technology advances. We're already in this period of modernism. The atrocities of World War II and just the attempt to annihilate an entire population and the mass murder is on a new scale. And at that point, we realize that the center really is not holding, right? That the world realizes that the atrocities that are possible. And so it's really post World War II and the shock and awe of seeing a true world war where the debate on when postmodernism begins. Does it come out of that movement out of the 40s? Does it wait to creep in when the 50s, when America really is everybody's hero and people come home and everybody can have a house in the suburbs? And of course, who everybody is depends on a lot of where you're born and what you look like. Another conversation. But all this potential seems right in America. And again, we get back to that focus on America as this is a class in American literature. We come to the 50s where prosperity is everywhere, the future seems bright, everybody is America's darling. And some writers say postmodernism comes there. Some writers say it takes until the 1960s when we have come out of Korea, and what even was that? And was there a winner and was there a loser? And then we see Vietnam starting. And some people say it takes till the 70s for it to really take hold. But somewhere in that time period, post World War II to the early 1970s, you'll find most scholars agreeing that this movement of postmodernism starts not only in the United States, but in the West, and really I'd argue by this point in the larger world. And what is the second term I want to talk about? Our first term, loss of ontological certainty. So ontology and taking that away gives us modernism. Loss of epistemology gives us postmodernism, or if you don't believe in it like Santa Claus, the continuation, the next phase of modernism. And so epistemology, again, both ancient Greek terms, but in general, to really, really paraphrase, it means knowing how to know. 1 + 1 is 2. Well, are you sure about that? Are you sure? Because we've split atoms. We've come up with these incredible methods of mass destruction. We don't, I mean, there just seem no limits. The center literally is not holding, and all of these ideas where science has advanced, culture has advanced, but in that advancement has come destruction and questions about basic being and cloning Dolly the sheep and all these ideas that happened during those decades really leave people with this loss of knowing how to know. So we don't know how to be, we don't know how to know. And so this idea then is that the world becomes a series of fractured pictures. And for me, the best way to read about the idea of fracturing is in a text called The Postmodern Condition. I'm a big fan of the French theorist Jean-Francois Lyotard is my favorite. You can just Google him, The Postmodern Condition, Jean-Francois Lyotard, Lyotard, and pull up a lot of full text of his work and also what other people have said about him. I think he gives you a really good picture of this idea because he connects a lot back to the idea of the graven image in the ancient sense and what happens when that image starts to fracture. And so remember at the beginning of the conversation, I said multiple voices come into the conversation. There are a lot of things that make that possible. Postmodernism makes that possible, potential, and probable. But as more and more voices come into the conversation, it becomes harder to know who to hear, right? And so by the time you see a film director, say, like Quentin Tarantino, making a film like Pulp Fiction, where things are out of order and all of these kind of tropes and tenets that really are clearly postmodern, the movement is a part of who we are. It's no longer a literary movement that artists are talking about, but it's part of where the culture goes. So as you move through a discussion of any American literature, modern American literature, which in most college settings is 1865 to the present, as we get farther away from 1865, that may have to change a little bit. Remember how we got here. We started in Enlightenment. We go through Romanticism and kind of tag along with the Brits for that. Realism gives us our own voice and our own brand of humanism that really leads to our own brand of modernism and postmodernism. But what drives those brands? Our take on loss of ontology and loss of epistemology. I think it's always important to remember that our young students don't know a world with ontological certainty. And as the teachers get older, many of us may not remember a world of ontological or epistemological certainty, right? They're few and far between, or even what that idea might look like. So as you work with American literature and you begin to teach modernism and postmodernism, really work to look at modern texts and modern shows. YouTube and Netflix and all these things are full of them, where folks have gone in and taken historical events or historical texts, American texts in particular. The Great Gatsby is a super example, and tried to modernize them to make it possible where we can understand that life. The Great Gatsby is a great example. You have the Robert Redford version from the 70s and the DiCaprio version from the 2000s. That opens the door to really being able to look at how our understanding of the high modernist moment of the Great Gatsby changes and evolves as modernism and postmodernism change and evolve in the American culture. And for more on information about how to use various critical theories on a text like the Great Gatsby, be sure to go to cleverchicas.com and check out the videos on critical theory and the Great Gatsby. Thanks for watching and be well.